This right here is Apple's garbage book. And the reason why it's the garbage book is because this thing was released back in 2009. This one specifically is the 2010 model. And what they did was they put a Core 2 Duo in this thing, didn't use aluminum, they just threw plastic together on here to make a cheap, affordable Mac. Now, at the time, this was a great idea, but nowadays, this thing is a piece of junk. I mean, look how the silicone is on the bottom now. Turned yellow. So this thing is just, has a shot battery, broken screen, broken keyboard, mechanical hard drive, and 4 gigabytes of RAM. I actually replaced the screen, so the screen's good to go. Keyboard is like missing a bunch of keys. This thing is bad. And I went ahead and I bought 120 somewhat dollars worth of parts so far just to get this thing running. That includes an SSD, brand new battery, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a new top shell with a keyboard. So we're going to go ahead and install this, and I really want to see if I can turn this piece of garbage into a fully working Mac. So here is the Core 2 Duo 2010 Apple MacBook, and as you can see, this is the MacBook that came in that white color that some people may remember. Now, back when I started refurbishing Macs, this was one of the first models that I worked on and basically got in all the time. It's one of my favorite models. I really love the color, and I really remember this thing from a long time ago. As you can see, here's the bottom, and over time, these like silicone bottom casings that these came with turned yellow just from, getting super dirty and worn around. It's supposed to be white, but that's just kind of what happens. And the battery isn't swelling, it just needs to be replaced because it says service now and it sucks. And then we got the original 4 gigabytes of RAM, these 2 gigabyte sticks in here, which we will be upgrading using 16 gigabytes of this Timetech RAM. That is my choice. And then I'm going to go ahead and repaste the processor to make sure that it won't fail on us with some Arctic MX4. That is my choice of thermal paste. And then we'll just give it a good clean. And we're going to go ahead and switch the body out, the keyboard and trackpad top casing. We're going to switch that out and do a new casing. And we're just going to make it pretty much brand new, kind of like a refurbishment. First things first, before we get to this upgrading, we're going to go ahead and boot this up because I want to go ahead and see what the Geekbench scores of this computer is as stock. No upgrades, no SSD, no new battery, no upgraded RAM, just stock, boring 2008 whatever on macOS High Sierra. And then I want to compare it and see how well it does with these upgrades. Anyways, getting right into here, we are rocking a 250 gigabyte SATA disk. This is just our boring spinny drive. That thing sucks. We have macOS High Sierra on this device. This is a 13-inch mid-2010 with a 2.4 gigahertz Intel Core 2 Duo processor and 4 gigabytes of DDR3 upgradable RAM. Now, this thing is fine. It's a 13-inch. We got a 1280 by 800 display. That's pretty much equivalent to a MacBook Air display, although I believe the MacBook Air display is a little bit better than this. But it's still not a bad display. It's not really horrible, but the angles, you can really see suck compared to like a Retina computer. But even with that being said, this is still an iconic Mac. This is the last Apple MacBook produced in a plastic body. Now, this thing is honestly pretty cool. It is very slow though nowadays. However, it is still very upgradable with the RAM and the SSD. Those two things make a big difference. Now, this computer obviously kind of resembles a MacBook Pro, but it is in between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. That is in size-wise as well as performance. It has the performance of a MacBook Air, maybe a little bit worse, but it also has the body style of a MacBook Pro, making this the affordable MacBook of 2010. And we come out with the CPU benchmark, and as you can see, these are probably the worst scores I have seen in a very long time. Now, of course, this is just everything before the upgrades. I don't know if the upgrades are really going to change anything for the CPU performance and whatnot, but it's always going to be fun to see. So, here's the CPU benchmarks. Absolute trash. Here's everything else. So we have everything ready now, the battery, the RAM, the SSD, and the computer, and we do have the new bottom casing with the keyboard and everything intact. So let's go ahead and open this up and make sure it's looking good and not broken. So they had multiple of these bottom cases available, and they so happened to send me the exact one in the picture, and I can see that because of whatever's going on here. It's like deep scratches, but that's okay. As long as we have the whole entire keyboard and everything is intact, then we should be good to go. This is pretty clean. Looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and switch everything over to the new chassis. So now I'm just basically taking everything out of this thing so I can switch it over to the new body. And you can actually see when I remove the fan here, look at all of that lint and dust buildup. A lot of times in old computers, they'll get really hot because of the amount of dust that's inside of them. Now, taking everything off, I started having trouble with getting the proper screws, and eventually there were 2 stripped screws in the logic board. So ended up having a horrible situation in the middle of taking this logic board out. Now this logic board is the logic board inside of that A1342 MacBook, and what happened is the screw right here, and I believe the screw right here, which actually this piece of the motherboard is broken now. These 2 screws were stripped, and there was nothing I could do to get this thing out of there. And I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to make this video, and I spent a bunch of money on stuff that would just become useless. The motherboard was the one thing that I needed out of that computer, and I tried so hard as to going under the screws, and I started actually ripping the back of the keyboard. As you can see, this is like the back where the keys lay, right here. I started just ripping this whole thing out, completely destroyed, cut up my hands just to try and get this out, and ended up getting no luck whatsoever, and I ended up just pretty much breaking this logic board, and now this thing is just worthless garbage. So at this point, I'm pretty frustrated, and I started looking through all of my parts and stuff inside of my office, and I actually found an exact motherboard for that computer. However, I didn't know if it worked or not, so I went ahead and just put it inside of the shell and plugged everything back up just to see if it would work. So after putting in that logic board, when I turned it on, the screen for some reason wasn't working properly. It was like at brightness level 1, except you could move the dial and make the brightness brighter, but it wouldn't actually, make the screen brighter. So I realized I'd have to buy a new logic board, and all over eBay, they're like $140 for a cheap freaking crappy logic board in this computer. So I was like, there's no way I can do this. And then I found one for $19. So I went ahead and placed my order, and it shipped and came here on time. And the only reason why I'm doing this is to make this video for you guys. So I went ahead and I installed this logic board, and it is ready to go. So before installing the logic board, I just went and applied some Arctic MX4 thermal paste to the GPU and the CPU, and that'll prevent it from overheating and having any sort of issues in the future. Okay, and after taking the logic board out, putting it in, putting it out, putting it back in, it's finally done. So all we got to do is put in our upgrades, our battery, and our RAM, and of course our SSD. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Here is our Timetex 16 gigabytes of RAM. This was an even $20 with tax on Amazon. This is my go-to DDR3 RAM because it's quite cheap and it works pretty well. Here is our battery. Alright, so here is our brand new battery, our verbatim solid state drive, whatever that is, and our 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now this Mac originally didn't have bottom case screws, so I went ahead and bought some on Amazon, so we can go ahead and have all 8 screws in here, so this thing doesn't just, break off and fall on the floor. But before we put everything back on, we're going to go ahead and test this thing out to make sure that it works properly and actually turns on. So let's go ahead and make sure everything works. And after countless times of trying to get the 16 gigabytes of RAM to work, it just kept beeping at me. And what didn't make sense is that before, I've done this multiple times with the same type of RAM. I've put 16 gigabytes in these models as many times as I can remember. And this is the first time that it didn't work properly. So now this Mac is sitting with an 8 gigabyte stick and a 2 gigabyte stick for only 10 gigabytes of RAM. So that just kind of made me a little bit mad, since I sunk like $120 into this thing just to not have the 16 gigabytes of RAM to work. All right, let's go ahead and download High Sierra and see what's wrong with this thing. So for some reason my USB wasn't working, so I went ahead and plugged in this SSD to the hard drive to USB cable thing into my 2011 iMac, and I went ahead and just basically formatted the SSD, and then went ahead and downloaded macOS High Sierra. All right, so it is finally done. Let's go ahead and, I guess, turn this off. And then we'll go ahead and put that into the MacBook. All right, and it is all set up, and it seems to be working just fine. So going over here to About This Mac, we can see that it now has the 10 gigabytes of RAM. The reason being is because, you know, what happened before. For some reason, I couldn't get my 16 gigabytes of RAM to work. So it only works with an 8 gigabyte stick and a 2 gigabyte stick, which is kind of silly. But anyways, here's our SSD. Displays the same, of course. And, you know, everything else is the same besides the RAM. Battery, of course, has a cycle count of 1, which is just great. And overall, this thing seems to be working a little bit better. It seems to be more responsive. However, it still has a little bit of lag to it. Now, I'm going to go ahead, if I keep saying gonna go ahead, because that's all I ever say, try and download Geekbench 5, and I want to see if these scores change at all, especially with these upgrades. So here's the weird thing. We have a higher single-core score, but we have a slightly lower multi-core score. So being 100% honest, it kind of evens out. The upgrades obviously really don't do anything for the Geekbench test. So that stayed about the same, just a little bit higher score on the single core. Now, like I said, I wasn't really expecting anything from that. I just really wanted to see if it would change anything. But let's go ahead and clean up this Mac. Since it is pretty dirty, I'm going to go ahead and use some 91% isopropyl alcohol and just kind of spritz it around here. And then I'm just going to use a paper towel and just clean this thing up. Now, there is a few things that I do want to address with this Mac. So, like I said before, this computer was created to be a cheap model back in the day, but obviously this didn't work out. Take a look at the bottom of this, for example. The silicone just turns yellow, and the back hinges of the screen start cracking. As you can see, that's a very common issue with these things, which means that the structural integrity of the plastic shell really isn't that great. A lot of times when people drop these computers, it would make like a giant chip, and like a big old piece of the plastic side would come right off. So these things were really not that structurally good, which is quite unfortunate, especially for this Mac starting at about $1,000 back in the day. Even with this computer's terrible structural integrity, this is the last white MacBook, especially plastic MacBook, that Apple has ever made. Now they're all aluminum and silver and all types of colors now. Which is much better than the plastic, because as we can see, this thing just does not age well, especially being 14 years old. This thing was just not meant to run as long as it does, but of course it's Apple, so the hardware on this thing is amazing. Although having a Core 2 Duo, you can run macOS Monterey in here and run the newest versions of like Word and stuff. However, you really need to upgrade to an SSD and 8 gigabytes of RAM to really make that possible. Now, this computer runs High Sierra naturally, which does support iCloud and, you know, things like that. And hey, you can even take photos. But even with upgrades, this thing is kind of slow. Just look at the camera lagging. It is terrible. And let's not even get started on the speakers. Now, the speakers on this computer are not the end of the world, but they do sound a lot better on the iMac. The iMac has stereo speakers, which is what I'm going to be comparing it to. So just go ahead and take a listen and see what you think. RAM running macOS Ventura. It was looking great, came with a charger. The only thing wrong with it... RAM running macOS Ventura. It was looking great, came with a charger. The only thing wrong with it... As you can probably tell, the speakers on the MacBook just are kind of ear-piercing. They're not beautiful. And the stereo speakers on the 2011 iMac are definitely a lot better. However, they're not amazing. But they do sound probably 10 times better than the MacBook. Now, that does complete the video for today. I hope you guys liked it and enjoyed it. This is definitely not a computer to just use daily. I would not recommend it. It is just kind of a horrible computer. It's beautiful, it's pretty, but it's thick, it's heavy, and it's just really a hunk of junk. The durability is horrible, and really the specs in 2024 just don't hold up and support many applications that are available nowadays. It's still a great computer that can sit on a shelf. It's a good thing to stream music on and maybe watch a couple videos here and there, but you're definitely going to want to upgrade it either way. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.